I wouldn't have answered the door if it hadn't been for that single, heavy knock. A sound so out of place in the stillness of my evening that I thought I'd imagined it. Outside, rain pounded the dark, empty street, casting a restless hum over the neighborhood. But there it was again, another knock, low and insistent. I opened the door cautiously, squinting into the night. There was no one there. Just a large package on my doorstep, looking somehow out of place in the orange glow of the porch light. The box was a sturdy, old-fashioned wooden crate, stained from the rain but strangely elegant, as though it had been carefully polished and wrapped by hand. The odd thing, though, was that there was no address label, no sender's name, just my own address scratched out in looping, ornate letters. I looked up and down the street, half expecting to see a prankster hiding in the bushes, but I was alone. Curiosity got the best of me. I picked up the crate and carried it inside, feeling the chill of its damp wood seep into my fingers. There was a weight to it, a deliberate heaviness that felt intentional. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just a crate after all. Probably some late delivery mistake from an eccentric antique store. As I pried the lid open, my breath hitched. Inside, nestled in soft, faded velvet, was a dollhouse, an intricate, impossibly detailed replica of my own home. Every tiny detail was captured, from the rough brickwork around the porch to the small stain on my living room rug. Even the furniture was the same, down to the crooked picture frame in the hallway. For a moment I was speechless, my mind racing through the impossibility of it. Who would go to such trouble? And why? As I continued to stare at the tiny version of my house, a card slipped loose from the bottom of the crate, gliding to the floor. I picked it up and read it slowly, a single sentence inked in that same looping script. Watch closely. My heart beat a little faster, and my mouth went dry. Watch closely. Watch for what? I placed the dollhouse on my dining table and circled it, studying each room. Every inch of the house, every little corner was there in miniature perfection. It should have felt silly. A dollhouse is a child's toy, after all. But standing there, alone in the soft glow of my kitchen, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. I flicked off the lights, thinking that perhaps sleep would bring me a clearer mind in the morning. But I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, still foggy from a restless night, I stumbled into the kitchen ready for coffee. But as I reached for the cabinet, I stopped, blinking at the scene before me. Flour, sugar, and salt were scattered across the countertops, as if a messy, invisible cook had ransacked my supplies. Bizarre, but I tried to reason it away. Maybe I'd left the window open and a raccoon had gotten in. It wasn't until I returned to the dollhouse that I felt that first flicker of genuine fear. Inside the dollhouse kitchen, there was a tiny figure, a doll that I hadn't noticed before. A woman with her back to me, standing in the dollhouse kitchen, her little porcelain hands dusted in flour. I could almost laugh at the absurdity, but something about it was unsettling. The doll's posture, the way it leaned slightly toward the counter, seemed a little too deliberate. Like she was frozen in the middle of some action, some act caught halfway in time. I couldn't shake the strangeness of it, but I did my best to shrug it off. I figured that if I just ignored the whole thing, it would make sense later, or at the very least, fade from my mind. Yet deep down, I knew the dollhouse would stay with me. I could feel it lingering at the edge of my mind, a quiet whisper in an otherwise silent room, urging me to keep watching. I told myself to forget about the dollhouse. That night, I locked it away in my office, closing the door firmly behind me. Yet sleep refused to come easily. Thoughts of that tiny, flour-dusted doll swirling in my mind. The storm outside had only grown worse, thunder rumbling every few minutes like a distant threat. When I finally drifted off, I had the strangest dream. I was standing in my living room, staring at my own home from a bird's eye view. I saw every detail, the crooked pictures, the chipped edges of the kitchen tiles, my rumpled bed sheets. It felt vivid and close, as if I were somehow looking at the dollhouse. Then, something small and shadowy moved in the miniature hallway, just out of sight. I tried to follow, but I woke up, tangled in my sheets, heart pounding. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop entertaining the strange mystery of the dollhouse. I went about my day as normally as I could, ignoring the nagging curiosity that kept tugging at me. But the strange incidents only escalated. That night, I returned to the office to find the dollhouse door, a tiny replica of my front door, slightly ajar. I frowned, certain I'd left it closed. Peering inside, I noticed something odd. The little doll from the kitchen was gone. I squinted, scanning each room until I found her, now standing in the miniature hallway, her hand outstretched toward the living room. Something about it left me unsettled. This wasn't just strange. It was impossible. A trick of the light? Maybe. Or maybe I had been too careless with how I left it last time. Either way, a chill crept up my spine, and I turned away quickly, resisting the urge to look back. Then came the footsteps. They started off faint, just a soft tapping that echoed in the hall outside my office. I froze, listening as they drew nearer, slow and deliberate. Each step felt like it was carefully placed, as if someone, something, was mimicking a careful walk. I held my breath, the silence of my house broken only by the steady, measured steps outside my door. They stopped just as suddenly as they'd begun. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. This was crazy. I was a grown adult, in my own home. There was no reason to feel so unnerved, but every part of me was screaming to stay away from that dollhouse. Ignoring my instincts, I forced myself to open the office door, half expecting to see, well, something out there. But the hall was empty. Only silence greeted me, stretching down the darkened hallway. I lingered for a moment, gripping the doorknob, before finally letting the breath go and retreating to my bedroom. It wasn't until I was settled into bed, half asleep, that I remembered the message on that note. Watch closely. The thought lodged in my mind, unwilling to be dismissed. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe just the weight of an unsolved mystery, but a compulsion overtook me. I slipped out of bed and found myself back in the office, staring at the dollhouse under the pale glow of the hallway light. Inside, the tiny doll had moved again. She was in the bedroom now, my bedroom, her tiny face turned up, porcelain eyes gazing right where I would be if I were lying in bed. And that wasn't all. The covers of the dollhouse bed were rumpled, the pillow dented, just as I'd left my own only moments ago. My throat tightened as I stared at that tiny, unmoving doll. She had been in every room I'd just been in, following me, mirroring my actions. I reached out and, before I could second-guess myself, picked up the doll. It was lighter than I expected, delicate in a way that made me think she might shatter in my hands. But just as I looked her in those lifeless eyes, I thought I felt her shift ever so slightly in my palm. I dropped her back into the dollhouse, breath catching as her face turned back toward me. I stumbled out of the office, slamming the door shut behind me and leaning against it, struggling to catch my breath. Whatever this was, whatever it wanted from me, was beyond anything I could explain. But I had the awful sense that this was just the beginning. I didn't go back into the office the next morning. In fact, I avoided it altogether, like staying away from a room would somehow erase the memory of that tiny doll following me around my own home. I busied myself with errands, went for a long drive, did anything to shake the unease lodged under my skin. But the strange, unsettling details from the dollhouse kept creeping back into my mind. By the time evening rolled around, I found myself pacing near the office door, unable to ignore the pull of it. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. I told myself I'd just look. Check on the dollhouse. Reassure myself that everything was as I'd left it. After all, whatever had happened the night before, there had to be an explanation, right? Maybe I'd just been sleep-deprived, imagining things that weren't really there. I pushed open the door. The dollhouse sat in the center of my desk, untouched, the tiny replica of my home as still and quiet as a painting. Yet as I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Trying to ignore the tightness in my chest, I leaned over to peer inside. I took in each room carefully, from the miniature kitchen to the tiny living room, until my gaze landed on the bedroom. The doll was there, just as I'd left her, lying on the tiny bed, her porcelain face staring blankly up at the ceiling. But as I watched, something caught my eye, a small, silvery glint near her outstretched hand. I squinted, reaching in carefully to pull out the tiny object. My fingers closed around it, cold and surprisingly sharp, and as I brought it into the light, I realized what I was holding. A miniature key. My throat tightened. It was an exact match of the spare key I kept hidden above my doorframe. How could it be here? I'd never shown anyone where I kept that key. I looked back at the dollhouse, half expecting to see the doll smirking up at me, but she remained as lifeless as before. I set the key down, shaken, and took a step back, but as I turned to leave, a loud click echoed in the silence. I whipped around to find the door had swung shut behind me, the handle refusing to turn in my grasp. I was locked in. Heart pounding, I rattled the doorknob, tried to force it open, but it was no use. I was trapped in the office, with the dollhouse. Desperation creeping in, I glanced back at the tiny house, half expecting the doll to have moved again. But no, she was still there, lying on the bed, as still as ever. That was when I noticed it. Another figure had joined her, a second doll, one that I hadn't seen before. This one was positioned just outside the miniature office door, its hand reaching for the doorknob, face frozen in a blank, eerie expression that mirrored my own rising fear. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized what it meant. This new doll was supposed to be me. I felt the weight of that silent gaze from within the dollhouse, its empty eyes watching, waiting. Panic bubbled up as I turned, jiggling the doorknob again, banging on the door, praying someone would hear. But the house was silent, nothing but the faint ticking of a distant clock echoing through the walls. As if in response, a creaking sound filled the room. I turned back to the dollhouse, frozen as the door to its miniature office opened on its own. The tiny figure, the one meant to be me, moved, its head tilting slightly, gaze turning toward the bedroom where the first doll lay. My mind raced, piecing together the unspoken threat, the silent message the dollhouse seemed to be delivering. My only choice was clear. I had to play along with whatever game this thing was setting up, follow the movements of my tiny counterpart, hope that doing so might unlock the door and end this nightmare. With a shaky breath, I stepped toward the door of my real office, mirroring the doll's hesitant turn toward the bedroom. The lock clicked softly, releasing me, and I stumbled back into the hallway, heart racing. But as I glanced one last time into the room, I realized with a sick certainty that the dollhouse wasn't done with me yet. This was only the beginning, and the game it was playing was far from over. I stayed away from the dollhouse for as long as I could after that night. But it didn't stay away from me. It started small, just the quiet feeling of being watched. Shadows stretched longer than usual, and I'd catch flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, like someone slipping around corners just before I looked. I kept the office door closed, wedging it shut with a chair, but the pull was still there, an invisible thread tethering me to that cursed miniature version of my home. One evening, the feeling became too much to ignore. I was trying to relax on the couch, but every sound in the house set my nerves on edge. The creak of a floorboard, the ticking of the clock, the whisper of wind against the windows. Each one was like a reminder, a distant, taunting call from the dollhouse. And finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I knew it wanted me to see something, and the only way to end this was to face it. I went back to the office, pushing open the door slowly. The dollhouse sat in its usual spot on the desk, every detail perfectly intact. I took a steadying breath, leaned in close and peered inside, half expecting the figures to have shifted again. This time, the scene in the dollhouse was more staged. The doll meant to be me stood in the tiny bedroom, her hand resting on a smaller version of my own bed. The strange woman doll was back too, her face turned away, watching the doorway. There was something different about her posture, something more alive in her stance, like she was waiting for me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave the room and never look back. But I knew that wouldn't work. Whatever was happening here, the dollhouse wasn't just a passive object. It was drawing me in, dictating my actions, as if I were as much a doll as the tiny figure that represented me. Resigned, I stepped into my real bedroom, following the instructions of my dollhouse doppelganger, placing my hand on my bedpost just as she had. For a long moment I stood there, feeling foolish, but also strangely relieved. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this would end now. But then I noticed something. The air in the room had grown colder, thick with a silence so profound, it almost had weight. And then, without warning, a creak echoed from the corner of the room. I turned, heart in my throat, and saw her. The doll-like figure from the dollhouse, now life-sized, standing in the shadows by my closet. She was exactly as I'd seen her in miniature. A porcelain-skinned woman with delicate features and eyes that were black, blank voids. Her head tilted to the side, regarding me with a strange, expectant calm. I froze, watching as her lips parted, whispering words that sounded like a distant echo, as if pulled from the depths of some forgotten place. "Come closer," she murmured, her voice soft and as chilling as the silence itself. I took a step back instead, the air seeming to thicken, pressing down on me. Her smile didn't falter, and with a slow, graceful movement, she took a step forward. My instinct to run clashed with the strange compulsion her presence stirred in me. It was as if she was pulling me toward her, drawing me into her world, into the shadows where she waited. "Why are you here?" I forced the words out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Her eyes remained empty, but a flicker of something dark crossed her face. A memory, perhaps. A hunger. She lifted a finger to her lips, silencing me. "You know what you need to do," she whispered, her words chilling my blood. As she took another step toward me, I finally snapped free of whatever trance had held me. I backed away, stumbling toward the door, and fled the room, leaving her standing there, motionless, as if she had never moved at all. I bolted the bedroom door behind me, my mind racing. I had no idea what need she was talking about, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a haunting. The dollhouse had become a doorway, and something had crossed over. Somehow I knew she'd still be there, waiting in my bedroom, just as silent and watchful as ever, until I gave her what she wanted. Whatever it was. And until I did, I wasn't sure I'd ever truly be alone in my house again. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined her standing just beyond my door, waiting with that blank, eerie stare. The quiet of my house, once so familiar, had taken on a new quality. Dark, heavy, as though it pulsed with her presence. I knew I couldn't keep hiding, but I didn't know how to confront her either. In the morning, bleary-eyed and trembling from exhaustion, I resolved to do something. If the dollhouse had opened some doorway to her, then maybe it could also shut her out. I returned to the office, unwilling but compelled, and sat in front of the miniature, hoping for some sort of clue. The tiny figures had shifted again, but this time there was only one doll inside. It was her, standing in the dollhouse bedroom, just as I'd seen her last night in my own room. The miniature bed was made neatly, its pillow undisturbed. I noticed something new. A small drawer near the foot of the bed was slightly open, revealing the edge of a dark, folded piece of fabric. My stomach twisted with dread, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached in, carefully prying the drawer open to see what lay inside. It was a slip of black lace, delicate and strangely worn, as though it had been handled 1,000 times. I pulled it free, feeling the chill of its fabric against my fingertips. The moment I touched it, I heard a faint echo, a whisper drifting through the still air of the room. "Bring it back to me." The voice was hers, soft and insistent. I felt a compulsion settle over me, a feeling that I needed to fulfill this request if I ever wanted peace again. But as I stood there, the lace in my hand, something else in the dollhouse caught my eye. A tiny second doll, one that hadn't been there before, sat in the dollhouse living room, slumped over in a small wooden chair. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, but when I did, my blood ran cold. It was unmistakably me, a tiny figure with tousled hair and slouched posture, wearing the same clothes I had on that day. The second doll's face held no expression, yet somehow it conveyed an air of exhaustion and despair. The message was clear. If I didn't fulfill her request, this was what awaited me. A hollow version of myself, trapped within the dollhouse, left in that eternal stillness. I swallowed hard, gripping the lace tightly in my hand, and made my way back to my bedroom. The door creaked open, and I stepped in cautiously, half expecting her to lunge from the shadows. But she was nowhere to be seen. The room was empty, save for a chill in the air and the slight scent of something floral and ancient, like dried roses. With a shaking hand, I placed the lace on the foot of my bed, right where I'd seen it in the dollhouse. I stepped back, breath held, waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. I began to think I'd imagined it all, that perhaps none of it was real, and I was only playing into a strange illusion. Then, slowly, a shadow materialized in the corner of the room, coalescing into her figure. She moved forward with graceful, almost floating steps, her black eyes fixed on the lace. She lifted it delicately, pressing it to her cheek with a sigh so soft it was barely a whisper. She looked at me then, her gaze empty but strangely grateful. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was softer this time, almost human, and I felt a flicker of sympathy. No matter what she was, there was a sadness in her, a longing that reached into some quiet, forgotten part of me. For a moment, I thought it was over. She looked at me as if to say goodbye. But then, just as she began to fade, her hand shot out, brushing my wrist. Her touch was icy, and as she withdrew, I felt something cold on my skin. A dark, swirling mark, almost like an imprint of her fingers, branding me. I stumbled back, watching as she dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone in the silence. The dollhouse, I knew, still waited in the office, and the mark on my wrist seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if it were calling me back. Whatever door I'd opened wasn't closed. Not yet. And deep down, I had the sense that it might never truly close.